Hi guys, welcome back to Chat with the Mindful Beekeepers. I'm your host Natalie B, and we're going to talk today about queens, when to requeen, why we requeen. Hi guys, welcome back to Chat with the Mindful Beekeepers. I'm your host. I've got the live YouTube that just kicked in at the same time. Sorry. Okay. With that being said, we're going to talk about queens and when and how to requeen and how that fits in our integrated pest management practices. So if you have, welcome back. If you have questions, remember you can ask them into the chat window and or on the comments in the YouTube live. I'm happy to see you guys. Hi, Richard. Hi, Ralph, Steve, Becky, everybody. I've got Naveen. Oh, Kim, how you feeling, Kim? Dwayne, Margaret, Sarita, and Larry. Wow, we've got a lot of people today. Melissa, Dan, welcome. And above all, welcome, Les. You're going to be our co-host and our guest of honor today again. And I will leave you the floor, and then I will curate the questions, and we'll take it from there.
So often I get called to people's hives because they want help with requeening. And often people call me and tell me they think they need a new queen. Where could they get a queen and things like that? So first of all, a lot of times I ask them why they think they need a new queen. Sometimes it's because they're not sure if they have a queen. Well, that you need to know. You need to be able to see eggs. And if you don't see any eggs, there are times of the year, like right now here in Central Texas, we're not seeing many eggs, and there are good queens. They're just not laying. So there's all kinds of potential drawbacks to just buying a queen and putting her in there. So I thought we'd talk about them first of all. And one of the reasons that people want to requeen is they feel like they have a really mean hive. And now we could set aside a whole separate talk for how to requeen a genuinely really mean hive. But often they think they're mean. And when I get there, they're not the least bit mean. And I ask them, well, where's your smoker? Oh, I can never keep it lit. Well, smoke makes a big difference. Maybe they're mean because you've killed some bees in your inspections and you've not used any smoke. Smoke really makes a big difference in their behavior. So it's a good idea to learn to light and use your smoker, because they can really help the bees stay calm and learn to be calm around bees. Often when I go to requeen somebody's hive for them, because they're mean, I take a queen cage with me, because if they turn out not to be mean, I want to cage their queen rather than kill her and make them happy by replacing her with the next queen and hope it's a little better for them. But it may not be any better. Plus, you go through the risk of losing them in the requeening process, because requeening is always carries a risk that they won't accept a new queen. And there are factors that help them accept a new queen. For instance, are they really distinctly different genetics? Like when we first got the Russians into the United States, they were getting very low acceptance because they were so different genetically that the bees were having a hard time accepting them. So there are things we can do about that. For instance, you may want to do that in Australia if you import semen from foreign bees. You may have that trouble of them being very distinct. And so there are things you can do to increase the acceptance rate. Mostly there, we do the opposite of what I normally do, and I make a divide, take the queen to the old queen to the new place. So the old queen is with all the young workers. If I think I'm trying to introduce a genetically distinct queen, I'll take her to the new place so that the young workers are with her because they're more accepting of any queen. The young workers tend to just accept, you could practically just turn her loose in there and not even make her wait the 3 days in the cage or anything. And she would just be accepted if you've let all the old field bees drift back to the original site. And it's mostly young workers with her that greatly increases acceptance.
And to specify, when you mean that you're taking her with a lot of the new nurse bees, for those of you who don't know what Les is meaning, he's going to take brood comb with all stages of brood from egg to capped brood and keep the nurse bees that are on those combs, minimizing the proportion of foragers that are the ones that are the most likely. The older the bees, the less likely they are to accept the new queens to start with, especially if those are different genetics. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. And when you make a divide and keep the new hive in the same bee yard, the older bees will automatically fly back to the old hive site. And so you lose the older bees. Mm-hmm. And that means you just have young bees trying to accept the new queen, and they're much more accepting of the new queen. But that means you're not requeening that hive. That means you're making a divide, really.
So Les, could you potentially do that and take out the queen from the donor colony, the one that has the larger population and the temperament that split is coming from, which is an effective split. And just after couple 3 days, when these guys are trying to rear their own queens, kind of take down the queen cells and make sure they're becoming, in effect, hopelessly queenless, and then bring back that split, quote unquote split, with that new queen that those nurse bees have accepted, and increase the chances of acceptance that way.
You could. That would be a step. The problem with that is that you have to make sure you got every last queen cell. Mm-hmm. You have to look over. You never know where they're going to put them, and you might miss them. If there is a queen cell, they won't accept the new queen very well, because I feel like, well, we've almost got a queen, one of our sisters. What I have done, if it's because it's a mean hive, what I've done is I've lifted up the whole mean hive, carried it 100 feet away, and set it in a completely new site, and put an empty hive right in the exact site of the old hive. And I've given them 1 comb of brood and maybe a couple of combs of honey from a really nice, good queen. And what that's going to do is all the field bees are going to leave the new site where they've been taken, and they're going to drift back to that hive with 1 comb of brood and some honey, and they're going to have to raise a queen, and there's no way they can raise a queen from their sister because there's no brood from their sister there. They're to raise a queen from their mother's daughter, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So that means that they have to raise a queen from a nice beehive that you have already. And you're kind of stuck with 2 hives. But then you have to go through the mean hive 100 feet away from where it was, and you'll find that it's much less mean because of 2 factors. It's lost a lot of bees. And when hives get more and more populous, they get crankier and more prone to extreme stinging possibilities. When they lose a fair amount of bees, it calms them down quite a bit. And the bees that they lost were the older bees, and those are the meanest bees anyway. So that makes going through the hive to find the queen much easier. And then you can get them to accept the new queen. And then once she's starting to lay some eggs, you could recombine them. But I probably would just leave them split into 2 hives. And now you've just got, you've got to get that the old hive, the hive in the old site, I should say, to raise a new queen.
Mhm.
And if you think they're not doing a very good job, you could recombine them. That would be fine. But you got to give that queen enough. I would like to give the bud queen enough time to raise and have some of her brood emerge. So I'd want to wait 26 or 8 days just to make sure that there's some adult bees, worker bees, that are daughters of the new queen before I recombine them, so that I wouldn't have any chance of them, of the old bees, killing the new queen.
So that's awesome. So that's really for like if you have a mean colony, it's temperamental and you're really wanting to change genetics, or that can also work for other colonies, but mostly if it's particularly difficult to adopt that new queen, that's the kind of things that you can do. If you have questions, I want to remind you to use the chat window in the comments to ask us those questions. And Ralph is asking all the way from Australia, he had to, are you hiding in the closet, Les? So now you have your hat, but you're hiding in the closet.
I am hiding in the closet. It's the safest place.
Right.
Because the TV's not in there, and the granddaughters their mom is getting a job, and they spend a lot of time with me, and they're not used to, they're used to when I'm here, they just come in and see me. So I have to hide in the closet, yes.
Sorry, I couldn't help myself.
That's okay, Ralph. I wanted to say we have Timothy Mitchell, who's actually dialing in on YouTube Live all the way from Tokyo, Japan. So that's the first time we have somebody dialing in from Japan. And it's nice to have you on. He's about 15 minutes from the Saitama Prefecture. So that's very cool. If you have questions, Timothy, just make sure to ask them for us. We are not very familiar with the beekeeping in Japan, but maybe you have things that you want to share as well. So welcome. And just appreciate your support. He says that he loves what we do, so thank you. Let me see if I've got questions. No more questions on the chat on Zoom, but I'm seeing 23 participants. So what are the other reasons to requeen? And I want to kind of highlight something that I was talking about with actually Kim, who's on the Zoom as well. She bought a queen and could have sworn up and down that there was no queen in that colony. And she ended up trying to requeen, and she found eggs in the colony. So basically what happens at this time of the year when it's super hot in Texas is that queens stop laying, and we think, beekeepers, that automatically we don't have a queen. And it's sometimes they can surprise us. Even experienced beekeepers think there's no queen, and then they do another last pass, and all of a sudden they find something, a clue that there's a queen. Les, what's your thought on that?
That has happened so many times. I can't. And then people have a queen that they don't know what to do with, and they're expensive. It's not fun to buy a queen and find out you didn't need her. This is kind of a waste of the queen, and it's a lot of money. I hope that you can find a home. It's not a good time to make a divide in Central Texas because of the drought, but it's a very common thing. And that's exactly what I wanted to talk about, because when you look in your hive, it really depends. If the bees are in the mode of expansion, like in the spring or in a big bloom where the hive seems to be growing, then the queen, you can look at the queen's egg laying pattern, and that'll be very indicative of indeed her true ability to lay. So if it looks good, it's good. If it looks bad, she's not a good queen. She might need to, if it's real spotty, you might need to requeen her because she's spotty and she's going out. But during the time of contraction, when they're hunkering into either a hot dearth or a winter, a lot of the queens lay very spotty, even though they're very good queens. So you can't judge a queen during contraction. Also, it's hard to get them to raise a queen during contraction, and they're less accepting of new queens So in some ways, unless you're absolutely positive you don't have a queen, which is really hard to be,
Right.
it's best not to order that queen and just see what happens, because I looked in a lot of hives recently. There was honey in a lot of the cells. There was no room for any brood. There was not even any open space. And I went back 2 weeks later just now, and I looked at them, and there's a tiny little
Patch of
2-inch circle with some eggs in it. And that's all they're going to raise is a couple of inches of brood, or maybe 2 combs right next to each other.
Mhm.
And that's all they need to maintain a dearth season brood nest.
Mhm.
Because they're looking at a dearth right now in Texas. We're in our summer dearth, which can be as hard on the bees or harder than the winter dearth. And this summer has been pretty tough so far. They've made some honey, but it's been really hot.
Yeah.
And it's been not any flowers. So they've shut way down, and they've greatly dropped the population. And in order to drop the population, what they do is, as the brood emerges, they backfill with honey, or they just don't clean it, and they condense, and that gives the queen no place to lay any eggs. Remember that the queen doesn't really decide how many eggs she's going to lay.
Right.
The workers decide for her, and they prepare the site, and then she goes where they've made the scent, and she knows, oh, I have to lay an egg here. And she measures the cell with her forearm and lays the egg. She measures the cell to tell if she should lay a drone or a worker egg. And that's entirely up to the worker bees, not up to her.
Right.
So if they don't prepare any sites for her to lay eggs, she doesn't lay any eggs. And that means the death rate greatly exceeds the birth rate, and the population falls.
Mhm.
And the cluster, the brood nest, gets smaller and smaller. And the bees around here fall quite a bit. They get really small because the bees that are used to a really cold winter fall to a larger size because they have to maintain enough bees to keep warm in a really cold winter. They need a jacket of bees around the outside, enough bees on the inside to generate enough heat, for instance, to hold back below zero temperatures.
Mhm.
But the bees from tropical regions can get really, really small and just come through the hot, dry season with a handful of bees. And as soon as it rains and the flowers start to bloom, they'll suddenly start cranking out that brood, and they grow exponentially.
Mhm.
So it just takes right off. And pretty soon they're rapidly expanding. And that's when you judge your queens. When their laying pattern is when they're in the expansion mode. When they're in the collapsing mode, you can't really tell by the egg laying pattern how good the queen's going to be during the time that she needs to lay eggs for expansion. It's a totally different time. So,
Yeah. So that's,
yeah.
I was going to say that's all excellent advice, and I might have missed it because I was chatting on the side, but the other way is if you, instead of buying a queen, you just give them some brood, some eggs from another colony,
Yeah.
if there are any that are available, to make a donation, and then you can see what they do with it. If they don't make a queen cell, chances are there's a queen in there. And if they don't have a queen, then chances are they're going to make queen cells and make their own queens with it. So we find ourselves, Les and I, not really buying queens anymore for several reasons. The fact that we have enough resources to go and share with other colonies, but also the fact that we're starting to feel like unless I don't want to speak for you, but we've talked about it before, the commercially available queens that are from grafted stock and are sometimes being pushed for production are not necessarily as good quality as the queens that we get from just them making their own queens on a swarm cell kind of a quality, and or even on a supersedure cell sometimes, but mostly the ones that they make, they feed better. They are able to develop them from the beginning as a queen larvae, and also they are able to open mate. And we find that the combination of those elements tends to make for much better queens that are much better adapted to the local cycles of weather and forage. Les, what's your take on that? But also, I want to take after that questions from our attendees.
Yeah, well, I feel like none of us can buy a queen. If we have a fairly strong hive, you can raise your own queen and get a better queen than what you can buy. Now, you may not have time because it takes about a month from the time they start with an egg till the queen is laying eggs again. So that's a consideration where it might be convenient to buy a queen. But yeah, we don't need to buy a queen because we can give them brood. And sometimes I've even gone to the extent of saying, this queen is really starting to lay pretty poorly. I'm just going to do her in before the hive gets any weaker and let them start raising a new queen. And the new queen is bound to be better than the queen that's laying a really poor pattern.
Even as an emergency.
Yeah, as an emergency, rather than buy a queen, because we have been very disappointed with a lot of the queens that we've bought. They come pretty small, they don't last. And so it's hard, we can get as good a queen or better. Some of the best queens we have are queens that our own bees raised. I don't take any credit for it. I just enable them to raise their own queens as they would like to do anyway. That's their job. They want to reproduce. They want to raise sisters into queens. And
they know how to do it much better than we do. Even though we keep thinking that we're better at it. So I've got a few questions. And Ralph, if Les hasn't answered your question about where the new queen goes in, just let me know and we'll revisit that. But I think we might have answered that question. Sherry's asking, we're stopped feeding sugar water in the hive to our bees. Is there a problem with replacing it with plain water? And I think Sherry's in Texas, so she's asking if she can basically put inside the hive a feeder with water instead of sugar water.
Well, they probably have a water source. Most bees establish a water source. You could try it. I don't think it would hurt anything. I'd be curious to get your take on whether they take anything out of it or not. Once you put it in there, see what happens. I bet they're mainly going to leave it alone because without any sugar in it, they're just going to bring water in from outside. I'm not sure whether we know the bees don't like water from a little puddle right in front of the beehive because when they don't defecate in the hive, they only poop when they leave the hive. And they don't like water to be too close to the entrance of the hive. And so I don't know if they would take water from inside the hive or not. That's an experiment I haven't tried.
Yeah, my take is it probably wouldn't hurt. The likelihood of them taking it would increase with the quality of the water that you're putting in there. If it's kind of like water from a water source they would otherwise prefer, like a swamp, like a pond, like a stock tank with plants or something. And if there's a little bit of salt in them, maybe as well. But why not, right? They're only using it for making brood fruit and dilute the honey and spreading over the cells in the comb to air it, to air condition the hive. There's actually a really cool video from Dr. Seeley that I just watched that was talking about how the bees were using water in the hive, and that's a really cool video, and I will put the link in the YouTube comments. But in the meantime, I wanted to say hi to Bruce with Swarmstead Beekeeping, Swarmstead Bees and Gardening. He's listening to us on his ride, and he's not asking questions, but he's listening to us, so that's always an option as well. Okay, so I have other questions left. Kim, follow up to the explanations that you mentioned earlier about requeening, and she's got that queen now that she's not able to attribute to the colony that she was thinking was queenless, and she wants us to go over how you might create a new colony or divide using the available 6 other colonies and this new extra queen. And I was thinking about you, and I mentioned the mixed origin splits that could probably be applied here if she wants to keep that queen and create another colony from that. Les, what do you think?
That could be a possibility. Would be to put a hive, an empty beehive, somewhere a little ways off, but in the same bee yard. And then go through each of your colonies and build 4 or 5 combs or 6 combs. Get 6 combs if you can, one out of each colony, and make it honey with a little bit of brood, maybe a fair amount of brood with some eggs, and then some eggs and brood, and 2 more honeys. So the brood is in the middle and the honey's on the outside, with all the adhering bees. But you have to make sure you don't get any queens, that you leave all the queens behind. And that's always a dangerous thing. It's easy to say, when you see her, there she is. It's dangerous to say, she's not here. She might be there and you missed her. You need to look over the combs really carefully.
Or there might be another one.
Well, that's a possibility. There is a chance that there's more than one queen. But if you look them over very, very carefully on both sides, and then put them in the new hive, the older bees and mix them all up. So one comb from one hive, one comb from another hive, another comb from a third hive. And that way they're so mixed up, they don't know what to do, and they don't fight with each other. It's like when you buy package bees, they just mix all the bees from several hundred hives or 100 hives all together. And they're so confused that they just accept each other. This is the same thing. And then you put the queen in her cage in that hive of all these mixed up bees.
Do you smoke at the same time, Les, to create a
little bit of smoke? But they're so confused about their hive scent that it's not a big issue. And then leave her in a cage, leave her for a couple of days. Let them get her out. If they don't get her out, make sure she gets out. And she should be accepted. And you'll have if you have 6, you'll have 7 hives. And she'll start laying eggs. And then all the bees will become her daughters after a time. But it's a way to make a mixed origin divide. I've done it recently where there wasn't enough bees to make a whole divide from one hive, but they were kind of running out of room. Thought if I could just take a couple combs and put them in an empty hive, and a couple of combs from another hive and put them in an empty hive, and a third and a fourth hive, now I'm up to 8 combs from 4 different hives. And if I give them a queen cell or a queen, they'll be a new hive for me. And I've made a little room in the hives they came from to disencourage them from swarming, because I was in a honey flow of cotton at the time and I didn't want them to swarm this late into the hot season. So I think that worked. It's called a mixed origin divide. We just bring a bunch of bees together that weren't sisters, confuse them enough that they just decide to accept each other and the queen. And again, the older bees will go back to wherever they came from, each of the hives that they might have come from.
So the principles are always kind of similar with that. So that's the beauty of it, is that you can start adapting that technique for many purposes. I got a question from Sherry. She did a couple cutouts about a week apart. The first cutout didn't have a queen and started raising queens. The second cutout found like they had a queen, but she never saw her the 3 or 4 times she looked, and she therefore combined the colonies with a queenless colony on top, or the queenless quote unquote colony on top of the one that was building queen cells. And then she found the queen in the top box. She said because she was very skinny, she didn't see her. So what will they do? Accept the living queen or continue to raise the queen cells? And by the way, there's a couple of things that can happen. The existing queen could go and kill the queen cells that are being raised underneath. But what I personally would do is, if you are able to now find that queen at the top, is I would separate them back, because then you'll preserve the genetics on both lineage, and you'll have potentially, twice the chances of having really good local survivor stock in your apiary. And if it hasn't been too long and that one at the top hasn't killed those queen cells at the bottom, it might still be time for you to separate them back. I don't know how long that's been going on. What's your take on that, Les?
If it's been very long, if it's been more than 3 or 4 days, I just let it be and see which ones they accept. They may decide they're raising a better queen than the one that's already laying up top. Or they may decide, yeah, this is a good queen, we don't need to raise a new queen, and ditch the cells. I don't think they would swarm. I think that but if it's only been a day or 2, you could still try to separate them. Just keep in mind that the queen is likely to find the queen cells and sting them, and then you would be putting them back together again soon.
So you would have to babysit it, basically, if you did that. Or you could choose, like Les said, potentially you could also leave them alone and let that queen kind of do its thing, and they will sort it out, right?
Yeah, I find, when I was first starting beekeeping, I kept trying to do stuff, and then I couldn't tell if it worked or not. And I find more and more that I intervene less and get more done by letting them make up their own minds quite a bit. And so they'll pick out the best queen whenever you combine.
Right.
It depends partly on the age of the queen cells. The queen cells are getting fairly dark brown colored. They're near to head emerging, and they're going to be able to pipe at that queen, and she's going to find them, and she's going to kill them before they get out. More than likely. But also the bees protect the queen cells. I've seen bees protect the queen cell, and they've driven the queen that emerged that was trying to kill her sisters. They've driven her out as an after swarm. So swarm left, the queen emerged, was prevented from killing one of her sisters. So then she left, and then her sister emerged and took over the hive and killed the rest of any other queen cells.
And that, in retrospect, that's also an instance where you might consider, when you're getting that second cutout, to set it aside in doubt and wait for a week or so. If you still don't see any signs of queens, then you can give them a comb of eggs from another colony, see if they're going to do something with it, rather than putting it directly on another colony, because we tend to miss those queens or those signs of queen rightness. Is that a word? But so kind of like, we tend as beekeepers to want to do everything right now. And my biggest learning experience has been to just kind of give them a week, see what they're doing. You're going to be able to better tell what's going on in the hive, what's missing, and if there's really a problem or not. And in doubt, give them eggs and brood, right? Capped brood, because this way you're bolstering them, you're buying yourself some time in case they are really queenless. So hopefully that answers your questions, Sherry. I've got another question from Kim. Are there other signs we could look for that might indicate queen status, basically, besides eggs? For example, in retrospects, the hive I thought was queenless were working busily and did not seem disorganized or lethargic, something I noticed in the lane worker hive last year. So other signs that might tell us there is probably a queen, temperament, things like that. Les, what is your go-to?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And you're right, she's absolutely right. When you open a hive, and even practically when you smoke it, you can hear, like if you smoke in there, like, and they're all spilling
Nervous.
around in different directions. That's a sign that they might be queenless. When you open a hive and it stays pretty calm and together, that's a sign that they have a queen. Now, it's not a guarantee.
No, it's not.
But it's a much more clear. They have a completely different behavior when they're queen right and when they're queenless. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times the queenless hives, so they all start buzzing their wings, and the whole hive kind of like, you see them moving in mass, in circles around in the hive, like they're lost, or they're moving around like in a whirlwind, but they're just crawling inside on the walls of the hive. A very good sign that they're queenless. And you can look and look and look and try to find a queen. That again is always dangerous, because the fact that you didn't find her doesn't mean she isn't there. I have missed plenty of queens. With all my years of experience, I still can miss a queen. So their behavior can tell you quite a bit. And then what Natalie said, when in doubt, if you can come up with a comb with some eggs in it from another hive, if you put it in, that gives them a chance. If they're completely queenless, they can try to raise a queen. And you'll know, oh, they're trying to raise a queen. They're completely queenless. You can either let them raise a queen or give them a queen or a queen cell or whatever you got at that point. And if they're not, if they have a queen, they're going to accept that comb of brood and say, thanks, it was a nice little boost.
Right.
And they're not going to try to raise a queen because they have one.
So yeah, that's a good insurance. That's a just in case insurance that buys you some time in addition to being a good insurance. So that's always a good tip, a good little trick there. Ralph, all the way from Australia, is asking, do the bees live longer over the winter, so not needing to produce new bees? Yeah, that's actually almost quite like a fourth caste of bees. They're called winter bees, and they're reared with a high level of fat bodies and vitellogenin. So they are not meant to be really foragers throughout the winter. They're meant to be mostly house bees that are taking care of the cluster and taking it through the winter and rear the first batch of brood in the spring, at which time they might start going out to forage, which is going to greatly shorten their lifespan at the time. The foraging is what really kills the foragers faster. Les, what's your take on that question from Ralph?
Yeah, for a number of reasons. They do live longer, almost twice as long in the winter than they do in the summer, 6 weeks to 12 weeks.
I've heard even like 3, 4, 5 months in some cases when the long winters are extending.
So, because they have much lower death rate. You know, foraging is very dangerous. There's spiders, there's praying manads, there's birds. We were getting in a discussion with some Australian beekeepers about birds eating bees recently on Facebook or something like that. Birds will eat a fair amount of bees. One lady claimed hummingbirds were eating her bees. I've seen hummingbirds eating mosquitoes and small insects, but I've never seen them eat bees. But they're flycatchers. So there's a lot of things they'll eat bees once they get out of the beehive. And then so yes, the winter bees are bigger. They're often raised in larger cells even. Like if you let bees build natural comb, the cells tend to be bigger and then get smaller and smaller and smaller, and then big and small in like stages. And that means they can choose where to lay their eggs. And that has an effect on the body of the bee. If the egg was laid in a small cell, she's going to develop faster and she's going to her body's going to be smaller, and she's going to have less vitellogen and less fat bodies in her body. And she's going to be more mite resistant, more disease resistant, less winter hardy. And if you raise her in a large cell, she's going to have big fat bodies, and she's going to live longer. She's going to be more mite susceptible. And so it turns out that if you let bees build their own comb, then you'll see in the fall, they go up and lay their eggs in the big cells to raise winter bees. In the summer, or in the spring, they start off with the small bees. In the summer, they raise all different, they just fill the whole comb with bees, small and large. But in the fall, they tend to come up into the larger cells to raise the winter bees. So they are a completely different bee.
And hence the importance of natural comb to let the bees use their comb to rear the brood to the needs that they have based on the various requirements of the season, which you cannot do when you have foundation that's only a unique size, even more so if it's a large size throughout the year, because in that point you're extending the development of the larvae and increasing the the time under capping that potentially increases the level of infestation with baromites. So keep that in mind. But natural comb really allows them the flexibility that they need to adapt to all the constraints in their environment, which foundation, no matter what the size, doesn't, because it's one size fits all, meaning they are less adaptable to the needs that they have.
Right. Natural comb, when you look at it, it looks pretty uniform. But if you get out and measure, if you take it out of the comb and hive and measure with a ruler the cells in different sections of the comb, you'll see that there is a marked difference in the diameter of the cells. And then it tends to kind of descend. They start out with large cells at the top. They make them smaller and smaller. At some point, they may start again with large cells and make them smaller and smaller. And that's on purpose. They prefer having a variable cell size.
Very good, thank you. I've got an interesting question from the bio beekeeper, which is really Christian. He's using the Nicot system, the queen rearing system, that's basically making the queen lay eggs into the little queen cells, the queen plastic or rubber cells, instead of grafting. And he's saying that he's got 6 that are running right now, and he wanted to know if he was killing his quality. So basically he's making 500 cells around with those, and he's saying he's producing lots of bees without grafting, but he's wondering if that quantity is bad versus a single or double splits per hive to keep the quality. And I'm guessing as long as you have the amount of nurse bees and the resources that you need to rear that amount of eggs as queen cells in a colony, that would work. But that's an awful lot of queen cells at once. So you would have to have a pretty large colony to rear each of those. And then you are going to need that many more mating nukes at the end, finisher nukes and mating nukes to accommodate those if need be, right, Les?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a better system than grafting.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
So it's just, I would watch my quantity, because if you force too many queen cells in a hive, they may get to where they can't feed them as well as they could if there were fewer. And just, you're going to have to experiment with that and see how they turn out. And really, it's a matter of, do you turn out really fairly large bodied queens, or are they kind of small?
Right.
And because what we've seen in the queen breeding business, when you buy queens, they often come out fairly disappointingly small. Mm-hmm. And so watch the main thing, if they have a lot of resources and lots of bees, lots of nurse bees, they can raise some really good queens, but don't try to raise so many that they can't feed them all as well as they could.
Yeah. Thank you, Les. He says 20 cells per builder hive, and he's got 1,000 mini Tabar mating nukes for mating. I like that you're using the mini Tabars for that. That's pretty creative. So very good. Awesome. Christine is asking, she's got Tabar hive nuke conversions the way we're doing them now horizontally. And she's got one hive that has only started one Tabar comb that she says we pulled up the laying frame next to it and it was almost completely empty, no honey or brood. Should I move this frame closest to the feeder and push the brood frames closer to the Tabar hive entrance? So I'm not sure I really understand that last question.
But we have quite a few of them being in that transition, transitioning from the nuke box into the Tabar hive. And I wouldn't bother with them too much right now. If you're in the Central Texas area,
if you're contracted,
you could feed them a little bit if you think that's a problem, and see if they'll put. So we have a few that I've like one I completely transitioned. They had 7 combs in the Tabar hive. They had brood in the Tabar hive. The queen was in the Tabar section of the hive. So I took away the nuke box, put the end back, and they're completely done. They're now living in the Tabar hive. But a whole bunch of them were like in your situation, where they had built one comb, and if anything, they've kind of contracted away from that. And now they're living back in the nuke box.
And that's
Feed
okay.
them a little bit and just let them be. Hopefully it's going to rain, and the sumac is going to bloom, and other things are blooming, and they'll start building again. And if they don't make it this summer, we may have to overwinter them the way they are and try again in the spring.
Right. So the conversion depends heavily on the cycle of expansion and the nectar flow. They have to be able to build comb into the Tabar part of the conversion and expand away from the Langstroth nuke that they originated from. So when you're in a period of dearth, like we are right now in Central Texas, you end up having a slowing or complete stop of comb building. And so for extended periods of time, they might not build anything, and like Les mentioned, might actually contract back into the box. And if you miss this season, or if you miss a secondary nectar flow in the fall, that they might not build all that much more in the fall, even with a pretty nice nectar flow. Sometimes they don't really want to do that. Then you might be stuck with not enough in the Tabar and having to keep the Langstroth nuke in place, which a lot of the ones that we are using are made out of that easy JZ nuke boxes. They're corrugated plastic basically, and you can tape up all the aeration holes to decrease the cross ventilation. That's good for the heat, but that's also good for the cold. And they're more able to control the temperature in their colony, which is actually pretty well insulated because it's corrugated plastic. So there's a layer of egg that's imprisoned between the corrugation, and that allows them to overwinter. We've done it, and it doesn't seem to be an issue for the bees actually. So you can leave it in place and then count on the next spring nectar flow to leverage that expansion. And it might take them more than a season to build into it and for the queen to start laying eggs into the Tabar section. Depending on how late in the season you started that conversion, you might not have a whole lot of buildup. The other thing you can do always when you install it is you push the brood frames of the Langstroth conversion box towards the opening where the Tabar hive is, so that they have more inclination to expand that way, to expand their bird's nest, and so that they don't have a frame of food acting as a barrier, keeping them into the Langstroth box, congesting them and pushing them to swarm instead of expanding into the Tabar hive. So there's all kinds of factors to keep in mind. But hopefully that answers your question. Les mentioned a whole bunch of answers. Let me see. Sherry saying she was in Thursday, pretty small colony, so she'll leave them be. The queen cells were capped. That's with those cutouts that she was talking. So she's going to let them be. Margaret, she says if the upper queen stings the ones growing in the queen cells down below, what happens to those cells? Do the bees clean those out? So that's again with the question from Sherry. She's following up with that question. And yes, right?
You can, and often you can tell if you look a few days after the queens got stung, the queen cells that are open right on the very bottom in a little circle, that queen emerged from that cell, chewed her way out nice and neat, and came out the bottom like she's supposed to. The queen cells that have a hole in the side and the cap is still on, that's where the queen stung her sister through the cocoon. And the bee started chewing around the sting site and ripped the body of the dead queen out and threw it out the door in the trash. And yeah, they'll clean it out, and then in a few days you won't even see where the queen cells were, because they'll have chewed it all up and made it back into just the normal comb that it was before. So yeah, they're very efficient cleaners.
So Les, I have a question that your comments just brought up. They tend to cannibalize their own brood when there's no resources, or they tend to not waste any resources, right? So a little bit like chickens would eat their own babies if they were dead. Do they not do that with the queens, which in my opinion would be better fed and fattier and juicier for them to recycle, basically?
I think it depends on the age.
Right.
Like they're not going to do much with a bee with hardened skin. They're going to throw it out the door. If it's still in the very soft, juicy stage, so to speak, as a pupae or a larvae, it's easy to cannibalize it and feed the resources to other bees. But if it gets to where its skin is fairly hard, and then it just kind of dries out and they just get rid of it.
So Christian's asking, do they eat all the royal jelly in those queen cells that they've cleaned out? That's always has extra, right? They never, when you dissect a queen cell, even after it's capped, there's always a whole bunch of royal jelly that was in overabundance that the queen didn't necessarily eat up. Do you think that they recycle that as well?
Yeah, they're pretty good with recycling. So, I mean, I've never seen anybody study that or anything, but they lick it up. I'm sure they lick it up and they clean it up and it's gone. What exactly they did with it, I can't say, but I have a highly doubt that they throw away anything that's halfway usable.
Yeah, and that Christian says it was actually not a question. He says he's confirmed that he's seen them recycle that. I know they do that on the queen cups that are not quite yet caps. I didn't really ever notice them doing it, but it would make sense on the queen cells that have been capped as well, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so what else did we not talk about? Queen requeening is actually a part of the strategies that we use for integrated pest management strategies. If you have really poor genetics, if you have a poorly mated queen, if you have issues with your brood, one of the strategies is to requeen. And so it's important to know how to do this and when to intervene with a requeening. But I think, Les, and correct me if I'm wrong, you also want to make sure that you stay mindful of the trade-off, because you might not always get a better queen out of this. You might bring in genetics that are not as good. You might not solve the problem, and it might not take. So it's not something to be done lightly, because in the process, you're also extinguishing the previous line of genetics in that colony. And so it's a pretty dire decision that should really, I think, maybe be kept as a last resort. What do you think, Les?
Well, yeah, the requeening is never 100%. So, if you make all the factors good, it's about 90 or 80% effective. In other words, they accept a new queen 90 or 80% of the time. But there's 10% of the time that they don't even accept her, even with everything you've done as best you can. So there's a risk there. And if that risk is, if you have a fairly decent queen, you don't want to take that risk. Or if you think you could get them to raise a daughter queen, that way you don't extinguish the line, you just advance it maybe a little bit. You get them to raise a new daughter if they're strong enough. If they're not strong enough, it's worth the risk to try a new, bot queen. That's fine. If you're going to try to get them to raise a queen, that's also risky as well. They will try, but there's, it's possible the queen cells don't mature right, or the queen gets damaged in her mating flight, so there's always risks.
Yes.
So when you can leave it alone and they get through, that's the best. And then they also keep in mind that when my old boss said, "Good honey flow makes us all good beekeepers," those risks all go down when they're making honey, and they all go up when they're in a dearth. So requeening is much more difficult in a dearth. Getting them to raise a new queen is almost impossible in a dearth. You just about can't force them to raise a good queen in a dearth. So this is not, in Central Texas, it's not a time to get them to raise a queen, unless there's absolutely no way around it, but it's not likely to work because we're in a serious dearth. As soon as it rains or as soon as we get a good bloom, then you might give it a try. But right now, it's not a good time.
But if you have to do this kind of things, especially at a time when there's a dearth, but even when you don't have a dearth, but you have, like, let's say, a harder acceptance rate, you can always increase your chances of them rearing queen or accepting a different queen by feeding them if need be. Right. Obviously, in a nectar flow, that's a lot easier. You don't have to feed as much or at all. Christine saying, Natalie, you touched on my question about pushing the brood closer in the Tabar nuke conversion and moving the empty frame furthest from the entrance to the Tabar hive body. But it sounds like the recommendation for now is to leave everything as is. Our other 3 Tabar hives have been building more into the Tabar hive, but still not enough to remove the nukes. I was just alarmed that we have a completely empty frame in the least productive nuke conversion. So a couple of things, you can potentially donate some brood from one of those other colonies, and that might entice them to start building brood into that colony and or bolster them if they're weaker in an equalizing fashion. Or that drawn comb that you have that's empty, if it is worker comb, you might want to leave it there, because if it's close to your brood frames, that's space where they're going to go next when they run out of laying space for the queen, and they would potentially expand that way. So I would do nothing, or potentially give them a comb of brood from one of the stronger colonies if they've got that many combs. What's your take, Les?
I would probably see about feeding them a little bit, and leave them alone, and see if they fill that one comb in the Tabar section with a little bit of the feed, and then maybe that'll encourage them, once the bloom starts, to continue to build. There's always variability in the how the queens build and how the nukes that you buy build up. And so it's not surprising that one is lagging behind the others. And by feeding them a little bit or equalizing them, if one's built a bunch of comb and that one hasn't built any, you could try giving them a comb with some honey from the other, see if they would move over and start there. But you can't really force them to build without a honey flow. So if you just make sure they have enough honey to survive, then when the honey flow starts, hopefully they'll take off and start building again. I wouldn't do too much at the beginning of a dearth.
So Ralph has got an interesting question. In Langstroth hives, the bees have artificial comb, meaning, I'm guessing, foundation. And in the Tabar hive, they're quite skillful in creating their own comb. Do they lose that comb making skill in the Langstroth hives where the comb is already there? I think that there's an argument to be made that over time we have kind of bred out from some of the colonies that knowledge, that know-how to build a natural comb with the various cell sizes. And sometimes when you try to regress them or give them the opportunity to build natural comb, it takes them quite a while in some instances to relearn that lost skill. What's your take on that, Les?
Well, Dee Leslie used to say that you had to train them to build a small comb. And the thing is, they physically, if they've been raised in large cells, 5.4 or 5.2, you can't put them in 4.8. They just can't even lay their eggs in it. Their bodies are too big. So you have to regress them by giving them slightly smaller foundation and then slightly smaller foundation, which to me is way too much work to keeping track of which is which and all that. So I just let them build their own. And what you'll find is that over time, they'll start getting right back to their natural cycles. They still carry the genetics of their natural cycles. And yes, we've bred them to be bigger, but they'll quickly breed themselves back to normal. And, you know, they breed, even though you give them a foundation and force them on large cells, they, everywhere they can, they try to sneak in a little bit of natural comb or drone comb in between the frames or wherever they can. So I just let them build their own. I don't try to think it through or manipulate them into building small. I just say, build whatever you want. You want to build lots of drones, build lots of drones. You're free to be yourselves in that box, as long as you build on the top bars. You can't build crooked.
Yep. So we're going to take just the last questions that are through. I want to say hi to James Arnold, who's joined us on YouTube, and remind him that we do this every Monday, 7:30 to 8:30 p.m. Central US time, except on the major holidays, like 4th of July, we were not on. But anyway, there's a question, the last question I want to tackle, because we're already at 8:32, is about forced brood breaks that Christian was mentioning. He forces brood breaks to throw off the mites breeding cycles. Basically, it's an intervention to decrease to curb the mite pressure and the mite population. And he says that it helps mimic swarming and or requeening. And then Dwayne's asking, well, how do you force a brood break? So, basically you can force a brood break by removing the queen and or splitting. Les, what's your take on that?
I have caged queens. I did a forced brood break for a couple of years where I went through and caged all the queens for 10 days and then let them loose again. Mm-hmm. And that put a brood break in the cycle. I've noticed that most of the bees in the Central Texas area have pretty much made their own brood break.
Yeah. Or
nearly, you know, they haven't maybe completely shut down, but a lot of them have. A lot of them have completely shut down all brood. But some have kept some brood going, but not very much. So that means that the varroa mite has very little brood to reproduce in. You know, in our class, we saw that one mite in one hive.
Right.
At the beginning of a contraction. That's perfectly normal to find. It's not anything to be afraid of, or it's perfectly normal to find some mites. Look, as the bees are contracting, the mites are forced out on the phoretic stage on the adult bees.
Well, and to what we've talked about before, presence of mite in itself is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just what the bees do with it. If they're using it as a tool to develop resistance and tolerance, then it's a pressure that we want to welcome to strengthen our bees. Now, if those bees are not performing well, then maybe we don't want to keep those genetics in the gene pool anyway. But the point is that they can perfectly perform, and if they're thriving in the presence of those mites, who are we to say that they need a curve, that we need to curve that pressure for them if they keep thriving year after year. Now, to your point, Les, forcing a brood break when the bees can do that very naturally for themselves, and forcing it for the purpose of curbing the pest is also removing that pressure, and also in a certain way kind of preventing them from developing their own strategies. And it's us again intervening into their lives and just kind of throwing them off, and thinking that we can sometimes maybe think better than them and how they can solve their problems. So I mean, I think you and I, we don't force the breed break by caging the queen, but we do splitting because we need colonies, because we use those as our income. We do place them on people's land and use them as service for our customers. So we do quite a bit of splitting, and I think that naturally allows our bees to have more brood break than they would have by following just the natural cycles of weather and forage. But in the grand scheme of things, even if you don't do that, there's that ebb and flow, that contraction in the dearth, potentially twice a year. And if we do decide to push our bees to keep rearing brood and we feed them, then we prevent them from taking advantage of that cleansing cycle, that sanitary cycle. And so that's something that we need to keep in mind.
Right. When I caged the queen, that was back at the very beginning of the mite infestation. And I don't force much on my bees anymore.
No, we don't.
Pretty much let them be with those. And I find that most of them do their own brood break without me worrying about it or trying to think it through for them. And some of the bees, there's variability. Some of the bees are still raising some brood. Some of them have shut it down quite a bit. Some of them have shut it down completely. And we'll find out whose strategy was the best. And maybe they'll all make it, but I don't worry about it. And really, I guess I want to advocate, trust your bees. You know, trust them to run their own lives. They're not telling you who to marry or what size shoes to wear or whatever. So don't worry about what they're doing. Trust them and see how it comes out. They're pretty intelligent in their own right. They know how to be bees better than I know how to be bees for them.
So with those words of wisdom, I want to say thank you to you all. Sherry saying, this isn't a question. I just wanted to say, I can't get over how knowledgeable y'all are. This is so very helpful. Thank you. And you are very welcome. And thank you for your kind words. And Christian, the bio beekeeper, says, I've noticed that the Tabar hive are better at mite pressure than the Langstroth hive, which is very interesting. That's a topic for another chat with the mindful beekeepers, because we very much so agree with you, and we can tell you why we think that is. And then Kimberly says, thank you as always. This has been so timely and helpful. Thank you all for joining us. We are thrilled to have you every week on Monday nights at 7:30 Central US time. I don't know what time it is in Australia, Ralph, or in Japan, but Timothy, but we're really glad to have you. Come on back and watch the recording on the YouTube channel if you've missed something or you came in late. Thank you very much. And above all, thank you, Les Crowder, for sharing your expertise and taking the time to answer all our questions.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you, everybody. And we'll see you next week, and have a good.
And feel better, Kim. Bye, guys.
Bye.